We know how you want it to be, but sometimes these things are bigger than you think. And you want to go back to New Jersey, but sometimes New Jersey's not as big as you think. The city is like a garden, and if you give it time, it'll grow. The ocean's only 7 hours wide. See, sometimes these things are smaller than you think, but all you see is the edge of the tide. And sometimes these things are deeper than you think. No one here is not on your side. I think you know. Sometimes what you have is more than you think. And you want to go back to New Jersey, but sometimes New Jersey's not as big as you think. When I go, what you say to us here, 'cause sometimes what you say means more than you think. And those you hold on to them dear, 'cause sometimes time is shorter than you think. When I go,
Welcome to the Museum of the American-Hungarian Foundation. My name is Patricia Fazekas, and I'm the curator of the museum. I'd like to welcome all of you this evening for a lecture by the artist who is currently exhibiting here with this wonderful 40-year sculpture retrospective, GYURI Hollosy. Those of you who were here for the opening of the exhibition may have watched him explain some of his works and manipulate some of the figure sculptures and got to speak with him one-on-one about some of his works. But tonight you're going to hear more. You're going to hear a lot more. You're going to hear about the origin of some of these works, the evolution of them, and some of the things and artists who have inspired him. So I'm very pleased to welcome him here this evening, and I hope you stay through the whole lecture, because afterwards we have a very nice reception waiting for you back in the Ola room. That will be your reward for staying all the way through the lecture, so you don't want to miss that. So I'd like to introduce GYURI Hollosy.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you for everybody that has come and to kind of see and hear about some of the things that I have sort of gone through in my, actually it's 49 years, I mean, or because it was like when I was 12 is that when I finally decided that, okay, this is what I want to be as an artist, you know, and due to a monk who was kind of burning these saints into the oak pillars. If I hadn't seen that, I don't know where I would be today. So it was through that inspiration that I'm here and have actually sort of put together 40 years of work. 40 years is where I sort of began to, in terms of the starting point, is with some of those pieces that are in the back of the gallery, that especially that portrait that is back there, which is the self-portrait in the blind. And it was a sort of an experimentation on my part in terms of seeing as to what can I experience through my hands, through my mind, in terms of being able to produce something without having to see it. I had closed off the studio, covered all the windows and everything, made sure I was working late at night. It was pitch dark in there. And even then, I very deliberately forced myself not to keep my eyes open so that even if I happen to get some night vision, that wouldn't be interfering. And through the touch of my face and then touching the material, I created that portrait of myself back in '68. And that's when I sort of began to realize that there is so much more than in terms of just making the figure. I mean, I'd always liked to make the figure. Michelangelo, Rodin were some of my early inspirations as what I wanted to do. And what I really came down to sort of feel is like there's more to it. And it was through a secretary of Rodin's, but he's actually a very well-known German poet, Rainer Maria Rilke. And it's through his observation and understanding is that the figure, it is just part of one thing. It is sort of like the muse, and then where you take it, where you involve with it, that becomes sculpture. In comparison to very sort of traditional, you know, modeling the figure and doing everything. And so I always sort of felt that. I carved stone, I did various different forms, but I was always sort of unsatisfied with just making the figure, making modeling. It was always something that I needed to do. And so there was a continuous search. I was sort of set in this pattern, looking, finding, trying to find something. What came down was back in 1975, I had, actually 74, I had met Cardinal Mindszenty, and I was so impressed by the man that I felt I needed to make a portrait of the man. And I decided to make him. But I wanted to do it in such a way that it sort of described in some of the form and the shapes and everything that were going on within the figure itself. I had looked at many works of Manzù. He had a number of the cathedral, or not cathedral, but cardinals that he had made, and the suggestions of form that's within the heavy robes and the cloaks that are there. Rodin had done a piece earlier called Balzac, which really didn't talk about too much at that point in time, and we really didn't know much about the history of Balzac at that point when I was sort of needing that sort of inspiration. I was also into Henry Moore and understanding the shape and form and where the power of the form really comes, and that really sort of comes from within. So that's when I decided, okay, using some of Henry Moore's ideas, concepts, as well as Manzù's, to start to develop this piece. And in the process of working, modeling the figure and the form, and using very thin layers of clay to kind of suggest or to accentuate some of the modeling that I was doing, I was developing this piece. In its process, I came across something interesting that caught my attention, and I liked it. But I didn't want to keep it in this particular piece, so I took some notes, and I began to sort of work with it after I had finished this, and started to make, to turn on the projector here. To use that particular concept of the thin overlay parts is to make the figure, the face, and this is Cardinal Mancendi, except now in my sort of language, the beginning of my language. And I started to do more in terms of the figures, the forms. Can everybody see these? I was very particular in terms of making sure that there was no markings of if I had rings on, I would take them off. If I had long nails, I would cut them down. I had no marks or anything on the clay form and clay surface. And begin to sort of develop the shapes. Also very concerned with the folding of parts, how they sort of overlapped, giving that very softness of the way the form and the shape. But at the same time, bringing that power from within out to the outer surface. This is a full life-size figure called Galatea. About this time when I sort of finished this particular piece, I felt like this is heavy, it's also very delicate. I want to continue with this point, so I began to change my whole concept, and I decided to go into metal. I made EOS. Again, each of these layered sections come together. They're sort of bolted, planished, and constructed so that they were unified in that connection. Is better? Okay. Thank you, Istvan. Then I proceeded to start to deal with the idea and some of the things that Rodin had talked about in terms of partiality, of being able to form, find the figure, find the expression, the gesture, the essence of that particular figure in parts of the form. So in other words, where I don't need the head, I don't need arms, I can just express it into certain points. So I began to work on a series called Variation of a Theme. And these particular pieces, I would begin to develop and only use certain points. Some of them have a very suggestiveness of water, the movements, abstractions. There's a couple of them in the back. Variation blue here, as you see it, and also the one in green. But I was able to go ahead and use the form and the shapes and do these particular things because each one of these particular elements that I had connected, because I was dealing with individually, I would then put them together. As I found out later on, which was also sort of an infatuation that I had, was to medieval and Eastern armor, especially medieval armor, the overlapping and that sense of the hollowness of the inside versus the form on the outside. I was not rejecting my classicism, okay, the figure itself. I wanted to elaborate on it. So I wasn't kind of looking to make anything more beyond it. Oh, and if anybody has any questions while I'm, talking here, please free to, stop me, ask me or anything, we can continue. This is sort of like a dialogue, especially if you have something that is, you have a specific answer instead of waiting to the end, you might forget it. This might be a good time to ask me, okay? So, I gave myself certain rules in that sense, especially working with metal and dealing with bronze. One is that I always work to the end. And what the language of wax was at that certain point, I would accept it at that point. Then when it became metal, then I would accept it at that point. then I'd have to make my decisions differently once everything was cast. So there were things that would come about, and for instance, when casting, things tend to warp. You don't have everything coming out exactly the way you put it into a mold. Sometimes you have a slight castings occurring whereby pieces are gone. For instance, in this particular case here, I lost a few pieces or sections of a particular section. And that was because I had a student with me, and we were packing molds, and we were short of sand. He ran outside, got some sand that was a little bit on the damper side. Our molds were hot. Moisture came into the mold. When we were pouring metal inside, an explosion had occurred. Metal was flying up and out all over the place, and it looked like we were going to lose the piece. So I told the student, I said, don't worry about it. Wait until we open up and see what's left. And sure enough, there were some pieces that did get misfired, get a part of the explosion. But then what I did is I used it as part of that and began to make a piece. I was also working on a section of a series called Interaction. We have one of the pieces back here where I was using stone and figures as sort of a sketch design of how they begin to work together as a composition. And again, feeling the gesture of the figure. Now about this time, a commission came into my hands from New Orleans. I was also leaving the city because I was from teaching at Tulane University. I went to Washington University. And this particular commission is it's a large relief, about 12 feet from here to here and about 16 from here to here. And this is a typical map of New Orleans itself, the Mississippi River, Lake Pontchartrain, the Jefferson Parish and everything. And all of these other pieces are very strong influences within the community of New Orleans, or the greater New Orleans. Amongst them is, like, for instance, here I have a portrait of Martin Luther King, who I did a commission earlier. I used it to put it in there. We had Napoleon as the French influence. This is the woman's influence, which is also my wife. And here we have the religious influence, and I put His Eminence, the Cardinal's face in it, which I sort of vowed that wherever I can, I will stick him as part of sort of my gratitude for him giving me this new direction. And we had Mark Twain, the influence of the Indians, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, Andrew Jackson coming through here. This was a little controversial because this side was depicting the fall of the South, so I didn't want to say too much about that at that point. The plantations, the family, the slavery that has been there, and of course down here the privateering, and that is my personal self-portrait there. But these are the things that I sort of used, and each of these pieces with this particular design I was able to make individually and then bolt them together as we were beginning to put one top on the other. And then, again, that's something that I learned from armor. This is a kind of a shot where you can see how high these reliefs were really developed. After I finished that piece, it was sort of like a change. The commission went out of the studio. There was a great void that had occurred at that point. I was like, what do I do? I mean, I couldn't come up with any specific ideas and everything. And I was going through my old work, as I do right now here with these slides, clicking, 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 and realized I need scale. I've been working on some smaller things. Yes, I did some life-size pieces, but many of the things that were on a small scale. So this piece is about as big as what you see here right now. So I started to develop these particular in this size. This is inverted motion, and again, adding more action, more feel of the dynamics of the form of the figure. This is a particular piece called Pierre de Sel. I composed it because, like I mentioned earlier, is that once I see it in metal, I begin to change, do things. And as well as certain things will happen is where I will reject a piece of metal or a section of an arm because I no longer need it at that point in time to complete my statement of what I want with the figure. This was, with exception of two additions that I had to cast for it, is all made of leftover parts. And there's another story to this too. About a year and a half ago, I got a call from New Orleans, because there's a woman that owns it down there, and she says, I found my piece and I need to have it restored. I'm going, what do you mean by you found your piece? He says, well, it got lost in Katrina. It was in the mud for about a year. They found it, and she wanted to know what to do with it and how to, So I said, well, ship it up here. I cleaned it up, I reworked it, and sent it back to her in New Orleans. So she had a reoccurrence, and briefly we did show it here in New Brunswick, while she was still here, but then went back. This is Precipice, again dealing with form in terms of, like here I was very specific in dealing with it, that keeping the lightness of 3 different points, that you have this massive form that exists on the top, and it just sort of is light, it just does not have any weight to it. It looks big, but it doesn't have any weight to it. Yes?
A couple of questions. One, is this layering style uniquely yours, or is anybody else?
Pardon me?
Is this style yours, or is there somebody out there, other artists who use this scheme of creating sculptures? That's
This
one
particular arrangement of sections, of fragmentation, is basically mine. There's nobody else working with this particular design. There have been some that sort of like, we call them sort of cross paths. They look almost similar but not quite, but they do different things. And that all comes down with the fact as to what is your mentality in terms of trying to express through that particular form that you're working with. They had a different approach to it. Mine was dealing with it in terms of maintaining the classical form, the classical figure, and then proceeding to expand by also dealing with internal. So in other words, I have internal space as well as external spaces that I have beginning to work with me. So the form changes. It's not only one dimension at that point.
The question is,
Yes.
I was trying to figure out what it does to the sculpture, this layering style. I was trying to figure out what type of special meaning or significance, or does it change the whole atmosphere of what the art produces? I haven't been able to figure it out. What does it?
Well, for me,
mean to you
yes.
when you look at your own creation?
For me, it expands the figure. It allows me to get away from the solidness of the form and to make it to a not quite abstract, but yet sort of, I'm actually sort of walking on the fence. Classical here, abstraction here, okay? And I'm doing this, and accepting both sides and then trying to mingle the two of them together.
My experience is it makes it dynamic. It makes the figure dynamic.
It makes the figure dynamic because in the process of accepting both sides, usually when people deal with the form, they go either total realism or they go into abstraction. And I'm trying to, do that center part when saying, yes, this is where we come from, this is our past, but there's the abstraction that pulls it together. And then when you find the two of them together, yes, it begins to be more dynamic and more expressive in that point because you have these two dichotomies that are working simultaneously. This is a series called Shored series. Unlike the other ones that you may see here in the gallery, which I will deal with later, but in this particular case, I wanted the figure to be lifted off of space, and it would be kind of supported up high. So I sort of engineered the idea that, okay, one or two things. One is that I want the piece up. At the same time, I would also like to minimize my work in casting. You know, I'm kind of lazy, you know. I'm casted, I want to get it out, I want to finish it, we'll go to the next one. So what I had done is these particular support systems that I had worked out are my venting systems. So I had the main gate coming through here. So when I poured everything, all the metal went in. Then I cut all of this stuff off. Cut the main gate off, retained the vents, and they became my support structures for the pieces itself. And they added another dimension in terms of seeing the figure or seeing it, you know, as it is being supported. But there was a little something in there that still left me a little unsatisfied. I was there with it, but I wasn't quite there with it. And I will explain that to you later. Now, this is about 1986. I ended up with two commissions. One was the National Hungarian Memorial in not New Brunswick, but North Olmsted, Ohio. And then also the Hungarian Revolution Memorial up in Boston. This particular piece took a number of years to complete. It was actually done in stages. So we had the first stage that I had sort of designed and worked out, which was this particular part here, with some urns that were situated in here. And then in 2001, we brought the two angels in, which was the angel of peace and the angel of forgiveness. And then came the two figures in 2004, Arpad and István. And that made the entire composition complete. It was easy to handle, because in stages you do certain pieces. This other one here, the Boston piece, which was constructed in 1986, and then when we had, we were asked to install the work and keep it there for 3 weeks and then dismantle it, take it home, and come back at a later time, which was fine. I thought, no problem. I dismantled it because my entire construction was in pieces. It comes apart in 148 pieces, so it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Basically, it's like every one of you would have one piece in your hand in the entire room, okay? And I would say, okay, István, you come over here, Michael, you bring this here, and then we go ahead and start locking it, the whole thing, and comes together as one big piece. There was also a stainless steel structure that I developed on the interior, and that was simply to add the additional support, partly because of the fact that this particular structure here, the woman's legs going up, and the baby here, which is 75 pounds, had to be supported in such a way, especially with the fact that it was holding out, that I had to engineer 3 to 4 times its weight capacity. It is in a major tunnel. There's also heavy snows in that area, so all of those things I have to kind of consider at that point. So we were successful. We did it. We went in. We installed. The first time we installed it was in '86, but without the flag, because I was not about to drag that into Boston and then drag it back out. And then we completed that. And then about 3 years later, the sculpture was finally installed, when all the construction that was completed around it, and that was part of the fear of the committee that the sculpture was going to damage. That's why we had to go in late, and some other problems that had occurred in completing the site. But finally, in May of 1989, the piece was up. During that time, after I had finished the piece itself, I was working on some pieces, but it was like sort of trying to figure out what to do. I had combinations. This is called the 3 Graces here. And then I had worked on these symbiosis figures of using 2 figures with the rock formation, as you had seen with the interaction of only having 1 rock. So I was like hunting, doing a number of things, using form. This is called cathedral, an idea of doing, some of the figure as a large form, something the size of a cathedral that you can maybe even walk into. I mean, all sorts of, notions came about. This one here is here in the gallery. Again, searching for those particular, something that would grab me at that point. I also ventured into a book that I had was reading. It was called The Five Rings, Miyamoto Musashi, and his Five Rings, and this is Void, the fifth ring. So I was, trying to see if I could, through literature, find descriptions of things, of thoughts. And nothing was coming to the point of where finally I just I can't think of anything. I seem to sort of be losing my language at this particular point of being able to communicate or find an expression. Something was, I was like sort of just revolving, rolling around, doing things. And I did a whole bunch of kind of strange little weird sketches and just drawings, various things, to where I proceeded to use lines, tape down lines, and work that figure out and to see what happens, if I pull the lines away. And then in that particular process, started to make my drawings. My earlier things were all done in paper. This particular piece is about 10 feet high and 8 feet wide. And then I started to go into scrolls, using raw canvas as like one of the ones that you see here on the wall, using enamel sprays, charcoal, again taping off, doing constructivism. Constructivism is something that I had sort of learned from a fellow Hungarian, Laszlo Moholy Nagy, in terms of his vision in motion and the activity of how things sort of evolve. And so that kind of, came into play, and I liked it, and I was making one scroll after the other, devising the seated nude, reflections, where I began to start putting two figures together and then working them within the space. But also at the same time I was starting to change. For instance, these particular dimensions that did not exist earlier, I had them white, and then I went to black, almost sort of having like a special frame for it, made them larger, and then started to make the upper lines shorter to where you can see some of them down there, especially inverted motion, okay, which is very distinct within that shape. When the Boston piece was finally installed in '89, it was like, whoa, I think I feel like I can make sculpture again. That's when I began to realize that this particular commission was such a burden on me, especially the fact that they had to sort of force me to keep it, instead of putting it out there, but keeping it, and I had to be sort of burdened with that entire piece. I tinkered with it occasionally, I would bring it up and everything, but it managed to sort of pull things from my other creativity away from me. Once the piece was finally put up, I started to work again and begin to think in other terms of forms. For instance, this is a piece called Dayspring, which in turn then I enlarged to a larger figure. And then I began to deal with concepts of connectional forms in terms of, and then to deal with them again to large pieces. Again, my forms now started to change, go greater within the dimensions. About this time in 1990, I won a commission in Arizona called The Family. And this one is a piece that in its completion state ended up to be about 18 feet by 18 and a half by 6.5 wide. You could actually walk underneath here, around, through the man's leg, without a problem. This is when we were constructing it. And then in Arizona, the city called Peoria, which is just next to west of Phoenix, it stands in front of City Hall. Now, after this, it was like, okay, I've done all these particular things. Where am I going with this? And the scrolls started to come into play. All of these drawings that I had done previously, which I thought were just drawings in themselves, or just completely on their own, you know, it had nothing to do with any of my sculptures. They started to play. And these were the forms and the shapes that began to come about. And I was using also the concept of symphonic poems, because I was really into the music, and any of you that are into, that has like 4 beats, 3 the same, 1 different. And so therefore what I was doing is that I would have 3 of the rods that were the same, the 4th one would be thicker. And so it's a dee-dee-da-boom, you know, changing in the patterns. But what I was also doing, and which was in the shore pieces that I was working with, was going to the system of the 3-point system. Now, something that I did with the big pieces, the earlier ones back in the early 80s, but I never really followed through them, and I realized that when I do that, it gives me the energy to lift. And one of the problems that I had with the shore, the beam pieces, that they would be sitting like 4 or 5 points on the ground, and it was basically grounding the piece in its motion. It wasn't lifting it up. It wasn't giving it any kind of activity. So I began to be aware of this particular occurrence in my transformation, and started to use that very extensively, very deliberately now at that point of what was going on. And this particular deliberateness then carried on to my future works as well. The other interesting part about it was that my scrolls, which were black and white up to this point, when I started to work in my sculptures, color entered into it. And I was beginning to make these colorized scrolls at that point. But up until that point, I always, rejected color. But now, whether it was something to do with patination of the work, and then seeing the bronzes in color, it had something to do with, I don't know, psychologically, but it entered into the game. I was having fun. My public was not having fun. And they had kind of like scrutinized my work extensively, to the point of, where I was sort of like torturing women and doing various other things, and it's like, and I just like, forget this, And so I went off. I went to Hungary, and I also went to see my great-granduncle's paintings, and Csontvai Darkoska, and seeing his massive work that was there, which totally devastated me, because I was like, and partially I think, because I was related to him, and seeing that kind of work, and seeing like, what am I doing compared to what he is doing at that point. And so I had a kind of a very difficult struggle in terms of finding or regrouping myself or grounding myself to where I was before, when I was doing my earlier work. And I was sort of just tinkering around, doing various pieces. This was actually a reinterpretation of the stone piece that you see back there. That one's called Creation. This one's called Adam and Eve and Us. Adam and Eve, and then we're in the child in the middle, and this burden, that's on top of us, And that was sort of like, you know, I needed to express that particular thing because I was having a burden on top of me, you know, and I was like the child that needed this thing to be lifted off. Yes?
What was the relationship you had with Jean Twary?
He was my great granduncle. He was my grandfather's uncle. Yep. So here comes Kathy B. Now this particular sculpture you can see in the grounds for sculpture. And her existence came out, actually originally I was supposed to have done something with her 10 years before. Kathy B. is a person that is of actuality. Her name is Catherine Baudouin. She was a jazz singer, a dancer. And she had wanted to see herself in an exhibition through the eyes of different artists. So amazingly, she got a grant. She got permission from the Contemporary Art Center to do the exhibition. And then she went around and said, I want you to do one, I want you to do one, something of me, blah, 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 blah. So I started to work on something, but then I ended up with a commission. I ended up getting transferred over to St. Louis. I got a position over there at Washington University. So I never really got to finish up. All I did was I boxed everything that was, you know, I needed to do about her, notes and all that. And then 10 years later, when I was going into this kind of strife, I said, well, I need to work on something. So I opened the box and I started to build and started to think and started to bring in and think about some of the thoughts that I had when I was working in clay. So I was sort of reaching back into my past to try to bring things together. And that's what happened with Kathy, is that, you know, all of that I had went through, and some of it was rush coming through to different points, you know, but many of the very delicate notes that I had done with other pieces, I began to express it in her. She gave me the ability to go ahead and progress to where I started to look at portraits again. I hadn't actually done a portrait since that relief. And well, actually, the portraits that were in this particular piece, where many of them came off of that relief for the Hungarian memorial. But I really sort of rejected portraits up to the particular point. Now I came back, and part of it was, this is Itzhak Rabin. He was assassinated. Somehow it sort of impacted me. A man who was trying to do something in the Middle East to achieve peace. And he was gone. And I began to read about his life. And in that particular process, then all of a sudden the sculpture came about. When I finished it, other things started to develop. Yes?
Is that supposed to be sort of a reference to like an olive crown or something of that piece?
Actually, that's sort of just the layering of the hair, because I've used that sort of the layering impact of, you know, one on the top of the other, and working sort of the shapes of the plating system to express the face, and maintaining as much of the kind of remember the first slide that I had of Vincenti when I did the first experimentation, sort of, you know, really reaching into that same venue of what I did in the clay piece. Then she came along. And when I say she, not the sculpture, but the subject matter. My daughter was born in 1996, and she became my inspiration to do this particular piece called The Bluebell Fairy, which was tough to do because I started when she was like about 3 months, and she keeps changing and changing and changing, you know, so I was like, finally managed to catch up to her when she was 6. But I gave her the Bluebell Fairy because it was something in terms of the Scottish have is that when you see a bluebell fairy, it gives you life. When you hear it, it gives you death. And having the child come into your life, you see your life, the beauty of the life and everything, but it also gives you that change in going into death, at that point. So I used that, but I gave her fairy wings partly because little children at that 6 months age do not stand. They can't walk. So she's on sort of like little tippy toes, and then she has these fairy wings to keep her upright at that point. It also happens to be my daughter's favorite, and it is hers. So every time I have to go to a show, I have to ask her for permission to. From there, I proceeded to other things. The Dalai Lama, and this was an interesting project because it was something where I wanted to do something of the man, but I wasn't quite sure where I was going to go with it. There was no particular sketches, so I said, well, make the head, make this robe, make this, make that, and somewhere along the line. So after I casted everything, I put everything on a table, I meditated for about 10 minutes, and then I said, all right, let's go. And I started to assemble, put things together, and began to just to work. 4 hours later, that's what came out. It's unexplainable how sometimes you work with something, you struggle, and you work on different things, you change, you do all sorts of things. And another thing that you kind of very simply just execute without even a thought, but just sort of let, time or existence, create it. Queen Nefertiti was also an interesting composition in the sense that I was actually had a friend who was going to model for me for other things, and every time we began to work together, there was this feeling like Egyptian. Something Egyptian was always going through my mind. I'd stop working on it, it would go away. I started working on it, it would come back to me again. So it was back and forth till finally I just said, fine. I opened up all my history books and I started going through, and I had a number of Egyptian books as well, and I just sort of floated, so finally I ended up with Queen Nefertiti. And I told Laura, I said, well, you're going to be the queen. And we proceeded to continue this, and I very deliberately, instead of casting it in bronze, I casted it in cast iron, because it was a very down-to-earth substance. So the only thing that is bronze would be the necklace, and then I welded inlays, bronze inlay sections into the helmet, and in so doing, even though it was cast iron, you had this metamorphosis of not being sure whether this is iron or bronze, one or the other, as you can kind of visualize over here. In '93, when I was in Hungary, there's a place called Mohács. It is a place where Louis II, the King of Hungary, battling the Turks, had lost his life. Today, they have made this entire battlefield into a huge kind of a pictorial memorial cemetery kind of existence, but using an item called the kopyafa, which is sort of like a totem pole that is placed on graves. And in Hungary, each of these kopyafas are carved in such a way that they symbolize either the male or the female, and they have various parts of the carving that also identify something of the individual. I was impressed with this entire vastness of these kopyafas, and I said, hey, I want to do something in that same kind of vein and follow through on that. And so I began to work on a series that I'm still working on, continuing with, is dealing with these kind of totem-like poles using very specific heads. Some of them are in terms of like, and there's 3 of them are outside. Martin Luther King, which is called I Had a Dream. Then my sister-in-law down here, and the short one she's called Lament. It's a concept. Then this particular pole here is called Samsara Nirvana, And this was again one of those kind of unusual, interesting things, because the portrait that I had used was the lady that had modeled for Queen Nefertiti, top and the bottom. And then when I had finished casting, I was trying to find something to fit it on. And when you cast iron, whatever doesn't come out, you throw away, because there's no way of remelting cast iron. It's just, that's the way it is. So I was going through the dumpsters, and I found this circular kind of disc type thing that had a whole bunch of footprints on it. And I asked who it was, and they said nobody knew. So I liked it, so I looked at it, matched it up to the piece, perfect, fits, boom. Fit it together, and then it became. About 6 months later, somebody recognized it. She says, "Oh, I know whose that is." I said, "Who's that?" She says, "Laura." The same person that modeled for the piece. She had cast a section during an iron conference, was not satisfied, threw it away. And I brought it. So there are these kind of interesting little stories that tend to happen. It's almost like it was made to be this way, you know, at that point. This is Wallenberg, the Lost Hero, which is outside. And I bring this particular piece here to kind of show you that even though I did this back in 1998, and I had it this way for many years, about 2 years ago, there's a branch that kind of somehow came into my studio, and I was sitting there handing it around, and then I just kind of, because it was in my way, I put it over onto the piece. And I sort of stepped back and I looked at it and I said, "Whoa, that's it. Now it's complete." And that's the way you see it here. Okay? So things change, even though there are certain things that have gotten to a point and you feel like, you know, you've said enough as it is, but obviously it wasn't enough until I actually bumped into that or pushed it into a particular area that made the work complete. Now, this is about 2001. And I'm starting to work on these ideas, is that, and part of my earlier pieces with the symphonic poem sections was, I like the concept of the idea is that the work moves. I can find not only that position, but I can shift it to other positions. And so I was sort of thinking, all right, go full figure and begin to deal with the idea of dance, composition of dance, in terms of how the forms begin to change, how they interact, pull apart, come together in these particular combinations. So I started to work on the idea of these figures. And the same thing again, being very careful, using the three-point system. Because if it has the fourth point in it, in the activity, it deadens the form, deadens the action, of the intent of what's going on with that. And in these particular cases, I was dealing with figures that were continuously in action, or as I refer to it as my series called Perpetual Motion, as the fact that these figures, though you may see them at some point one way, really can move in many different processes. Yep. Now, at this point, I think we can all kind of get up and we can go to the gallery, because any slides that I would show you here are much better seen over there in reality.